Welcome to all of you who've joined. We're going to give everybody about 2 minutes to get our whole crew in. We have 48 participants today, so that'll take a little bit of time to load. But while we're waiting, locate your chat box and let us know where you are. We'd love to know. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's session of Preservation Academy. I'm Elizabeth Castelny, CEO for Preservation Virginia. We'll have a few more people joining us, but to be mindful of the time, I want to go ahead and get started. Putting together the Preservation Academy requires planning and coordination, so our thanks goes to Sonia Ingram, Preservation Virginia's Associate Director of Preservation Field Services, for this labor of love and effort of Preservation Academy. I also want to acknowledge our panelists. They'll be introduced in just a few minutes, and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources for their support and collaboration on the 2023 series. I think it's been an exceptional year of educational offerings. Our appreciation also goes to our sponsors, Peachtree House Foundation, Daniel and Company, Monument Companies, Historic Richmond, and Commonwealth Advisors. And I want to thank each of you. Your registration fees help underwrite this programming and our other educational and community engagement endeavors. Today's session focuses on dispelling the myths in the world of historic preservation, and we certainly have a few of them. So whether it is how tax incentives are used, or what it means to live in a historic district, what it means to be listed on the state and federal register, there's a mythology out there about what you can and can't do, and sometimes it is truly myth. So today we won't get to every single one of these myths, but hopefully we'll brush the surface and help with you to dispel a few. But first, we have a bit of housekeeping. To make sure we use the most of our time together, we'll hold questions till the end. You may send us your questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A box. In the chat box, we'll be sharing links to resources and other materials. We will be keeping track of all of those questions that are in the Q&A box, and we'll respond to as many as possible. But in a follow-up email, we often try to get to the questions that we weren't able to get to while we had the presentation. So your question will be answered. You can turn on the closed captions for this presentation if you go to the bottom of the Zoom screen and locate the 3 dots that say More and click on Captions and then Show Captions. The instructions will also be in your chat box. This session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording in several days. If you misplace that email, you can check Preservation Virginia and DHR's websites where we post those links. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our partner in these endeavors, Julie Langen, the Director of the Department of Historic Resources.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for the privilege of partnering with Preservation Virginia for a second year on the Preservation Academy. I think we've all learned that a virtual training series actually gets better attendance than in person. So we really appreciate this opportunity. And as Elizabeth explained, today's session is intended to dispel some of the common myths that plague all of us who work in historic preservation, and I think are really an impediment to preservation. I know, like me, you've probably had conversations with people who absolutely are certain that if a property is listed, that means it's protected, or if it's listed, that means that there are going to be restrictions placed on the property owner. I've been hearing these for decades, and I'm sure you have as well. So today our speakers are going to try to hit some of these myths head on and can't address all of them. I can't wait to see the questions that people put into chat today. I think they'll be very, very interesting. So I look forward to learning and hearing, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Julie. And Karice, I think you're next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have the honor today of introducing our lovely panel of experts. And I will start with Lena McDonald, who is the Register Historian for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Jessica Ugarte, an Architectural Historian and Tax Credit Supervisor for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Maral Kalbian, owner of Maral Kalbian Consulting. Sonia Ingram, Associate Director, Preservation Field Services with Preservation Virginia. And Amanda Terrell, Director of the Community Services Division, Virginia Department of Historic Resources. And so now we are ready to begin.
I forgot to unmute. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for attending today's webinar. I am going to begin by discussing a lot of the, myths that still come up on a regular basis at DHR. I answer questions about these first 4 items on a regular basis. So let's dive in. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with an introduction about what DHR's register program is. I'm not going to read all the text on this screen, but should you want to have this information available, the slide deck will be available to download. I think at the same time that you get the link to the recording of the meeting. But I did just want to say that both the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places are honorary recognition of significant historic, architectural, and cultural resources. And they both lead to permanent documentation being maintained both in Richmond at DHR's headquarters, as well as at the National Park Service and the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. So register listing is, as I mentioned, an honorary designation, and it means that in the sense that it does not encumber private property in any way, the way that donating an easement, a conservation easement on a property creates a permanent restriction on certain uses of a property. Property owner permission, at least from private property owners, is a requirement in order to list the properties in the register, either or both of the registers. And it is, when you have multiple owners, you do have a simple majority vote. So that means 50% plus 1 of property owners. If you had 4 property owners, though, you would have, if 2 were in favor and 2 were opposed, the National Park Service interprets that as 4 properties or as a majority vote in support of the nomination. And then if you have 5 owners, 3 in support, it goes on from there. We do have to emphasize that in order to be listed in the registers, a nomination is prepared, and it has to be based on sound historical research, as well as an argument that establishes why a property warrants listing in the registers. So there is a myth that properties have to be aesthetically pleasing in order to be listed, but that's not the case. Next slide, please. So in terms of what kinds of places can be listed, it is basically anything man-made that is both historic and has integrity. So historic districts, battlefields, archaeological sites, buildings, structures, Structures are things like bridges and railroad corridors, objects such as fountains or a large outdoor sculpture. And then other types of historic properties also can be listed. As I mentioned before, the listing leads to permanent documentation, which is a big deal because even listing in the National Register won't guarantee that a property remains forever, which I'll get into in a little bit. Next slide, please. So first of all, this is a persistent myth that the historic registers and historic preservation are the concern only for people who are wealthy. And it is true that the earliest nominations to the VLR and the National Register tended to focus on places associated with wealthy, powerful people, the homes of the several presidents who were born here in Virginia or who lived in Virginia during their significant careers are a perfect example. Monticello, Montpelier, Mount Vernon, Highland are all listed due to their association with different presidents. We also have a property listed for association with President Woodrow Wilson, and I'm sure that we have some other ones. The other favored early emphasis of the register programs was major events, and here in Virginia, it goes without saying that the Revolutionary War and the Civil War were two of the not just events that were important here to us here, but to the entire country. But the registers have from the beginning not just been for properties associated with nationally significant events or individuals. Their statewide and local significance also are appropriate for register listing. And it's at the local level that the impact of register listing, I think, is truly felt, because the local residents, people who've lived there for a long time, people who move to an area and want to learn about it, they can look to register listed properties that are locally significant in order to learn a lot about their community. The Department of Historic Resources has a web page or collection of web pages on our site, dhr.virginia, which is spelled out .gov. We refer to it as the VLR Online, and it has photographs and the full text of nominations, including maps for every property that's been listed here. And these are organized by locality, which is mostly cities and counties. We also have a separate collection for National Historic Landmarks that you can find, and those, as the name implies, are nationally significant. And, you know, one of the main objectives of the historic preservation field nowadays, and has been for at least the past 20 to 25 years, is to bring more opportunities to list properties that have significance in areas that were overlooked, frankly, during the first 3 decades of the program's existence. Black history is of transcendent significance to the history of Virginia and the United States, because Virginia is where the first Africans arrived, who remained permanently, and whose descendants remained in Virginia. And it is also the place where slavery and inherited slavery were introduced to the country. So without Africans and African Americans, Virginia's history would look nothing like it does. And we are always very happy to say that we have managed to list managed to have approximately 10% of register listings for resources associated with Black history. Riverview Farm is a fantastic example because it's locally significant for its association with Freedman and his spouse, who established the farm during Reconstruction after they were emancipated. And then their children, their daughter went on to become a very important teacher for several decades, and her husband was significant as a extension agent for the USDA's farm assistance program that started in the early 20th century. So I know that a lot of folks might say that just looking at the picture, that's not a place that would ever be listed in the registers, but fortunately for us, it is. Next slide, please. But an area where we would love to make more progress is with regard to Virginia's dozen Indian tribes. We have not had nearly as much success. There are fewer than 2% of registered listings associated with Virginia Indian history. There's a couple of examples at the left, and while we haven't had a lot of success so far, DHR has recently established a program for a permanent program for consultation and relationship building with each and every one of the tribes in Virginia. More information about that will be forthcoming because this program was only established last July 1st when the General Assembly approved legislation and funding to create it. And then, of course, there are other underrepresented communities that we would love to have more communication with, including immigrants from the very many countries who've come to Virginia from all over the world since the beginning and continue to do so today. People of LGBTQ plus identities, religious minorities, and there are just vast areas of untapped potential with regard to Virginians and their contributions to the arts, the sciences, education, law, all kinds of fields of endeavor. And we are working every day to find ways to document these kinds of properties. Should you be interested in getting in touch with DHR staff about a potential nomination, we do recommend that you start with one of our regional offices. There are 3, and the staff there are deeply familiar with the service areas in their regions, and they are going to be fantastic sources of information and assistance for you. We also are very blessed these days to have an assortment of state, federal, and private grants that can assist with costs associated with research and in field investigations and preparing nominations. And you should visit DHR's grants webpage as well to learn more about these opportunities. We have a staff member whose purpose is to facilitate and manage all of the grant programs that are available through DHR. Her name is Caitlin Sylvester, and she too is a recent addition to DHR's staff that was approved by the General Assembly a couple of years ago. Next slide, please. So myth number 2 is that once a property has been listed in the registers, it can be neither altered or demolished. And this myth is definitely, unfortunately, in some ways not true. Because listing is an honorary designation, it cannot encumber a private property owner when it comes to making changes to their property, or if they so choose to demolish it. We always tell people, though, that if you must check with your local government to make sure that you stay in compliance with their building codes, permitting requirements, including demolition. And that's true for any property, not just registered listed properties. A sort of cousin to this myth is that people will say, I have friends who can't make any changes to their historic property, but you're telling me that the register listing does not prevent that. The reason that there are occasions where a property owner is restricted from making changes is because some of Virginia's localities have established historic preservation programs that include local designation of historic districts and occasionally individual properties too. Local designation is handled entirely by the local government without input without any requirements imposed by DHR. So the local zoning ordinances, the process that they have for evaluating a permit application are entirely decided at the local level. The reason that there is some confusion about whether state or federal agencies are involved in property owner decisions is because we use a lot of the same language, and we should have probably thought better of that when these programs were being established. So local historic districts and locally designated individual properties are subject to review by local governments. However, properties listed in the state register or the federal register do not have any kind of oversight from the state or federal level. Next slide, please. And then, as you probably have realized, based on what I've already said, properties listed in the registers are thought to be permanently protected often, and it's not the case. Private property owners, commercial developers, other private entities are not required under law at the state or federal level to do a particular thing when it comes to a historic property that's listed in the National Register or the Virginia Landmarks Register. Local governments also are free to do various projects as they see fit if they are using their local funds. But next slide, please. There are laws and regulation that restrict what the federal government may do with regard to historic properties. They are required by law if they issue any federal money, a license or a permit to an applicant to take historic properties into account when it comes to approving or funding those projects. So for the most part, these are things that I think we're all familiar with, things like road widening, electrical and natural gas transmission corridors, changes to wetlands, gravel mining or coal mining or other types of minerals. Those are situations where there is a process in place, and DHR does participate in these processes in order to find ways to avoid or mitigate any adverse effects that a potential infrastructure project may have on a historic property. That it is possible for these projects to proceed even if it does result in demolition or damage to a historic property or multiple historic properties. And there are processes to mitigate those kinds of effects, but people who are laboring under the belief that a federal or state register listing is going to save a property from a project are going to be disappointed. While public involvement in these kinds of projects is a requirement, sometimes public opinion can sway the project to proceed in a way that will spare a register listed properties, but it's not guaranteed. And there are always many reasons and many considerations that have to be met in order for a project to serve the highest and level of good for the public, even if that means losing a historic property. Next slide, please. And the fourth myth that I hear about a lot is that there's a lot of money available to help pay for repairs to historic properties. And while I mentioned earlier that it's true that there are lots of grants programs out there now, each of them has its own application process, and many of them have specific types of historic properties or aspects of a history that are the point of the grant. So for instance, the History of Equal Rights Grants Program is managed by the National Park Service, and its goal is to document and list properties associated with the struggle for equal rights throughout American history by any group that has argued for that. Meanwhile, the HBCU grant program is for historically Black colleges and universities, which historically were underserved by state and federal governments when it came to funding. And so the HBCU grant is intended to facilitate preservation of historic buildings on a campus, to make repairs, as well as to document and nominate them to the registers. The Virginia General Assembly has been a national leader in establishing some new grant programs for historic properties. The African American Cemeteries and Graves Fund is immensely popular. It is intended to help pay for maintenance and preservation of historic cemeteries where African Americans are interred. The Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund has been around for over a decade and has resulted in preservation of thousands and thousands of acres of historic battlefield land across the state. Meanwhile, the Black, Indigenous, and People of Color grant is much, much newer. It was only authorized by the General Assembly last year, and DHR is in the process of accepting the first applications for that program. So I would encourage you to be optimistic that you will potentially find a funding source to help you with whatever project you may have in mind, but also to please bear in mind that not every project may have a grant available for it. So we ask that you contact our staff and seek guidance on which type of program might be most appropriate if you're interested. And I think that's it for me. Yes, I now pass the baton to my excellent colleagues.
Excellent. Thank you, Lena. So Lena is really the expert at National Register things. So any questions should really for that. She's very accessible via email or phone calls. So my name is Jessica Ugarte. I'm the tax credit supervisor here at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. I also have history of doing advocacy and public policy work. So while my slides kind of run the gamut of different sorts of subjects, some of them have to do with tax credits, but others have to kind of just do with more general things. So our first one here is myth number 5, a historic designation like the National Register will reduce my property values. We hear this quite routinely. So studies have regularly shown that historic designations and preservation activities actually increase property values for listed properties and the surrounding properties. Obviously, this is not set in stone, but this has been looked at in places across the country. In 2017, DHR partnered with the Virginia Commonwealth University to create this report. You can see it on the right, Preserving the Past, Building the Future. And this report was done to determine the statewide economic benefits of the tax credit program. So we're kind of specifically looking at the tax credit program, but that has relation to the National Register and just historic preservation in general. The study found that the dollar for dollar value addition in historic properties is much higher compared to properties in general. So we're looking specifically at historic properties compared to just properties in areas. Furthermore, the National Trust for Historic Preservation or Historic Places points out that Place Economics, which is a private firm that specializes in analyzing economic impacts of historic preservation. That's a really neat site if you've never looked at it. Again, it's called Place Economics, but they have tons of different reports from around the country. Place Economics cites studies throughout the U.S. that show that the trend of property values increasing in historic neighborhoods is typically true, with property values in historic districts rising more consistently than in areas that are not historic districts. In addition, their cited studies showed that historic districts maintain their value during times of real estate devaluation, such as the recent recession, and they recover more rapidly. So while this is kind of a new-ish field as far as people looking at the actual data of, what happens in historic district versus not historic districts, a lot of the data that we are getting shows that this kind of positive impact, both for within the district, but even kind of the surrounding satellite areas, is overall beneficial. Myth number 6 is that the building is just too far gone to be preserved. And so with very rare exceptions, and I've experience with, historic buildings throughout the country, actually, many historic buildings are well suited to being brought back to a state of utility from either long-term neglect or major damage. As the saying goes, they don't make them like they used to. Historic buildings are inherently kind of more well suited to restoration than a comparable modern building. Part of this are things like old growth wood that's more resistant to damage and deterioration, or the much more material intensive construction of older buildings, such as solid masonry walls. Even in situations like fire and floods, older materials tend to hold up better than newer products. I've seen multiple projects that were originally thought too far gone, kind of like the Warm Springs pools that we can see in these images. These pools were, they're wooden stone structures that have been sitting on top of a damp, wet environment for the past 150 years. These have been brought back to a state of utility and have been reopened to the public, even though they were thought to be too far gone. I've also seen, buildings that have had major fire damage, but because of the inherent materiality of these older materials like brick, or like old growth wood, heavy timbers, these buildings can be rehabilitated. So I know sometimes the first response and the first kind of gut reaction can be, oh, that building, we just need to raise it to the ground. There's no hope for saving it. But sometimes with a little bit of extra investigation, it's found to be reasonable and maybe even preferable to rehabilitate the historic building. So myth number 7, new construction in a historic district requires a design that appears old or traditional. And this is actually something that I come into contact with quite often with the tax credit program. So the Secretary of Interior Standards actually requires that new construction or other related new features be contemporary, and so be able to be differentiated from the historic building and compatible with the overall historic building and site. So this really means different things in different situations. There's not kind of a one size fits all. Sometimes that can be in the form of a new addition that is built of a similar material to the main building, but with simplified and compatible design. As can be seen in this image here, we have the middle image that shows the front of the house, and then you can see this brick addition of a very similar colored brick, but it is definitely different than the historic building, but it's subservient, it's located in the back. It's kind of trying to recede from view. Other times, the way to differentiate the new construction is to make it be a different material. We see this often in kind of industrial complexes where we're trying to distinguish between, kind of different sorts of warehouse buildings, and we're trying to kind of get the compatibility in a different way. Or it could be through some sort of different roof line or other sorts of differentiated features. If you are in a local historic district that has a design reviewed board or commission, so again, it's a local design review board or commission, a good place to start with any kind of conversation, any new construction plan, is to review any guidance that might be provided by your local government. So I have an example up here of the Abingdon Historic District. They've got a design review guideline book, so that can kind of be a good place to start if you are in one of those areas. So I do want to give one kind of caveat as far as that is that the standards when we're dealing with the historic tax credit program can sometimes be a bit different than what might be found in a local design review guideline book, just because the local guidelines are very focused on a very specific set of resources. When tax credits, so both the state and the federal level, when we're looking at things like new additions, there might be some different ways that we look at things. So while it is important to ultimately get that approval from your local design review commission, we often recommend that if part of your historic tax credit program project includes a new addition or any sorts of other big major alterations to the exterior, that you work with the state and the state staff members such as myself or the other staff with the tax credit program to kind of look at what you're thinking of with your addition, so that we can kind of figure out where we need to go before you go through the full design review process with your local board. Because while that is necessary, what we don't want to happen is that all of your planning gets done and you get all of your permits approved and all of your, the design review approvals that are needed, and then you come to the tax credits and things need to change. So sometimes that can be resolved by just kind of coming to us first, having us help you work through some of the standards, specifics with additions, and then you can move forward with the rest of the design review process with your locality. So I'm not sure if you all have seen the Carl Elefante quote, "The greenest building is the one that already exists." I hear very often that it would be much more green, quote unquote, if we tore down a drafty old building and just constructed a brand new LEED energy efficient certified building. The Preservation Green Lab, which is another great resource, if you look that up, they completed a report entitled "The Greenest Building: Quantifying the Value of Building Reuse." And they found that when comparing buildings of equivalent size and function, building reuse almost always offers environmental savings over demolition and new construction. Another study showed that in the city of Portland, Oregon, retrofitting rather than demolishing and replacing just 1% of their office and single family buildings over the next 10 years would help to meet 15% of their county's total CO2 reduction targets over the next 10 years. So those are kind of some of the more recent kind of findings as far as looking at old buildings and whether or not it's more energy efficient to keep what we have and rehabilitate it or start anew. One of the important things to think about when we're talking about new versus old and which is, quote unquote, more green is embodied energy, which is the energy that's been put into a building's construction. So that includes things like harvesting raw materials, manufacture, transport, and then actually the construction, and also if you demolish, then moving all of that material into a landfill. So when you're looking at a historic building for reuse, all of that embodied energy has already been spent. It's already captured within the building. And so retaining that building and reusing it protects all of that instead of putting it all in the landfill. Because one of the things that I've been fascinated to learn about is that construction and demolition debris makes up over 25% of what goes into landfills yearly in the US. And so, if we're looking at ways to kind of control that, not demolishing buildings, not losing all of that embodied energy can kind of help us offset some of the other things that we need to do to be more sustainable in the future. The other thing to think about is that it does take between 10 and 80 years. That's a big range, but I think the average is 20 to 30 is what they had seen for a new energy efficient building. So that's a new building that's being built to be energy efficient, for that building to recoup the climate change impacts created by its construction. So even if we do have a new building that's being built, there's still a gap in time whereby the benefits is not realized as far as that energy efficiency. And then we would just hope that that new building would be able to last the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years that it would take to recoup that. So those are all things that kind of go into that argument on why it might be more sustainable to restore and retain historic buildings instead of demolishing them. The other old myth that I get quite a bit with specifically the historic tax credit program is that old buildings can't be energy efficient. One of the interesting things is that if you look at historic architecture and just kind of trends in architecture, many old buildings take advantage of passive climate control. So that's things like shutters, that's things like deep overhanging porches, transoms. You can see some of those features in the Patsy Cline House in Bristol. So those are all things that we can still use to control the climate within our historic buildings. Aside from the inherent kind of ways that old buildings dealt with interior climate issues, there's many simple interventions to a historic building that can be made to increase the energy efficiency of an older building. So things like storm windows, properly installed insulation, sealing air gaps. Those are all things that have a much bigger impact than simply removing all of your historic windows and replacing them all. So those are things that our tax credit staff are always happy to talk with people. In addition to dealing with tax credits, we do also work with technical guidance. So even if you just have questions about things like this, as far as ways to make your home more energy efficient, we can direct you to some good guides, or you can also do an energy audit. Those are some things that can be very useful in an old home. Another myth is that old buildings are not safe. The fact is that rehabilitated historic buildings do need to be brought up to modern safety standards, but there are many ways to achieve that. So especially when a building is being massively rehabilitated or there's a change in use, modern code and safety requirements do need to be met. So you're not just getting a pass for an old building. But it doesn't really make sense to compare a 100-year-old building to the construction of today. And so because of that, there is a part of the International Building Code called the International Existing Building Code. And so when we're looking at the International Existing Building Code, we can specifically look at Chapter 14 of the IEBC, and that talks about performance compliance methods. And so those performance compliance methods allow for consideration of the inherent strengths of old construction and allows for suitable comparable solutions to allow for older buildings to meet code. So in those cases, we're not pretending like the historic building will be able to meet code exactly as new construction might say it should be, but there are often ways of making comparable or comparable equivalencies to meet those safety needs. So things like, you can see these great example, it's not in Virginia, but in Philadelphia City Hall, I thought it was really neat to see how they hid sprinkler systems within this very decorative coiffured ceiling and provided that safety in this very distinctive space. Another thing that can be installed are fire curtains. So when we have these grand staircases or these grand atriums, these are fire curtains that are hidden until an alarm goes off, and then they drop down to prevent smoke from being able to cause life safety issues. It can also just be something as simple as new supplementary railing. It's hard to see on the Charlottesville example on the right, but the two kind of upper porches, the second floor and then the third floor porches that you see right there, all have supplementary rails that have been installed behind the historic railing, and that was needed so that college students would not be up there and fall off. And so those are all kind of compatible ways where we're meeting code, but we're still retaining the historic character of the historic building. So it can also often be said that old buildings aren't ADA compliant, and that can be true in a lot of cases. That said, there are a lot of ways to resolve those sorts of issues. So each building is different, and it does have different accessibility needs to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So in some cases, technological modification, as is seen in the left-hand 3 images, can provide the needed access. Other times, a simple and sloped ramp along a front elevation of a very modern looking building, as can be seen on the right, which is the Dan River Executive Offices building in Danville, Virginia. that can get people where they need to go. One note with the Danville example on the right, there is a black railing that is installed on that ramp that's not shown here. It hadn't been installed by the time this picture was taken, but just in case anybody sees that and worries that that is not code compliant, there is a railing on it. In some cases, new doorways, perhaps on just right next to a primary entrance, or elevator tower additions, or even removable ramps can be used to both meet the requirements of ADA, but also provide a historic building that retains its character while kind of meeting those needs. Myth 12, which is my last one that I will be dealing with, is that homeowners can't take advantage of the tax credit program. So we do have a May 31st Preservation Virginia, the Preservation Academy workshop on May 31st, and that will deal specifically with homeowner historic tax credit program questions. So I won't touch too much on that, but I did want to talk about the fact that tax credits can be used by small businesses and individuals, and we're here to help you. So historic rehabilitation tax credit staff are available to talk to you about the specifics of the program and your project. So whether it's questions about the application process, questions about how your project should go, or even, as I mentioned, technical questions, we're happy to talk with you and assist you as best we're able to. Specifically we find this useful for homeowners. It is not necessary to know all of the technical terms or to have architect created plans. We have a pretty good tolerance for being able to work with hand-drawn plans. As long as doors and windows and walls are in about the right place, we can usually work with that. The other common misconception, specifically dealing with homeowner projects, is that the minimum expenditure threshold for a homeowner occupied home is only 25% of the assessed value of the building in the year prior to work beginning. So let's just say, and when we're talking about the assessed value of the building, we are talking specifically just the building minus the cost of the land. And it's the assessor year prior to when your project starts. So let's say the starting value is $60,000 of your building, your homeowner occupied building. The minimum expenditure would be $15,000 in order to be eligible for the state program. If your starting building value was $100,000 and that was your home, your occupant or residency, the minimum expenditure would be $25,000. This does differ from the commercial or rental properties. That minimum is 50% of that building's assessed value. But that's kind of one way that the state of Virginia tries to make the tax credit program a little bit more accessible for homeowner occupied properties. And with that, I will pass it on to our great Maral to continue.
Thank you very much. And these were really great presentations, and a lot of the myths have already been presented. And I thought what I would do as a consultant that's been working in Virginia for 35 years now is just tell you the most common ones that I hear. And absolutely, hands down, the most common myth that I hear is that if I'm in a historic district or listed on the National Register, I will not be able to make any changes to my house without getting permission from either the state or a local architectural review board. I hear this almost any time I start a new project involving a locality where we're looking at a historic district. And all I can say, Lena touched on this, is unfortunately, National Register historic districts share the same name as local historic districts. So people hear historic district and they just get confused, and that's completely understandable. And to be able to just repeat that being listed on the National Register is an honorary recognition, all I can say is that just has to be repeated and repeated and repeated. And we just have to educate and educate and educate. And I find that the time invested in doing that has huge payoffs because you want everyone to understand what these programs are all about. So I just, think that's like the biggest myth that's around. I also hear, if I'm in a historic district, I'm going to have to take my building back to a specific time period. And I tell people, well, you don't, first of all, if you're in a historic district, National Register Historic District, you don't have to do anything to your property. And no one is going to make you like remove the plumbing and remove the electricity and take it back to what it was. And even for rehabilitation tax credits, when they're a little bit hesitant about applying for those, they're like, well, I just don't want to have to take it back to a certain period of time. I think that comes again from the confusion that arises because there are standards for restoration versus preservation versus rehabilitation. And these are all distinct. And the tax credits are available for rehabilitation, not restoration or preservation. So I think, again, it's repeating it, educating. As I work a lot with local architecture review boards as a consultant, and we just never can do enough of trying to educate the public, either through public presentations or through the written word. And DHR, as you saw in our two earlier speakers, they're very competent and have amazing resources that are available on the website. And I think that Sonia has posted those links, and those are really important to have and answer a lot of these questions. And again, there's nothing wrong with just repeating and repeating and repeating, because it is complicated and sometimes it is counterintuitive. Another thing that I often hear is, oh no, I don't want to be in a historic district or listed on the National Register because I don't want to have to open up my house to the general public. And there's no such requirement to be listed. And I don't know where that confusion comes on. If people think if they're automatically listed, their house is a museum and they have to open it up. I don't know. The only thing I can think of is that there are, some caveats when properties are held in easements. And they will be required to open it up, one day a year or something like that. But that's all that I can think of that would create that myth. Another myth that I hear a lot is, my real estate taxes are going to increase right away. And Jessica, talked about increased, property values in general with preservation. And, there's that aphorism of a rising tide lifts all boats. And I guess it's been shown that, if there's a historic district and there's a lot of investment in rehabilitation of historic buildings, that would help property values. But while this may happen, it doesn't have to do with National Register listing per se. So I have asked and checked with multiple commissioners of the revenues and assessors to see, hey, do you have a box that you check off, for being listed in the National Register or being listed in a historic district? And they look at me like, what are you talking about? We don't know that. Do you mean if a house has a plaque on it, then do we, value it for more? So they do not have a little box. Very often they're not even aware that something is in a historic district. And so that's another one of the myths. When I was asked to be part of this group, I guess I was a little confused because I initially thought, oh, well, what are the myths that I hear about historic preservation? And they're more about like historical research and history. So I want to share some of those with you because you might run into these too. So there's huge confusion with property owners, confusing when the first deed is recorded. Like they'll do I always tell them, well, do a title search and just take it back as far as you can. That'll give you the names of the property owners. That'll give you the acreage. That'll give you a description. And from there, you can, dive off into the deep end and find out all you can, looking at land tax records, looking at census records, all that stuff. And so very often there's confusion with when their first deed is recorded, with meaning that that's when the house was built. And you see a lot of that, in this area. Let's say there's dates of houses, the 1740s when the first deed was recorded, but the house is a mid-19th century house. So I always try to tell the property owner, that's just a starting point. It doesn't mean that's when your house was built. Then I'm sure we could have a whole session on different local myths about historic preservation that people like to believe. One of the ones that I hear a lot here, and I'm located in Clark County, which is in the northern Shenandoah Valley, or the lower Shenandoah Valley, because the Shenandoah River flows north. Anyway, mine is the one that I hear the most is, the stone or bricks from my house came over from England as ballast. And I hear that just all the time. And so I just try to explain that, not only would shipping it across the mountains here have been very difficult in the 18th century, matching the pieces. Think about that. Would all these stone pieces match, and the cost of that when you've got stone in your front yard and in the fields that had to be cleared in order to be farmed, and dirt is very plentiful for making brick. And there is some documentation that shows that very few houses were built at seaports using some of these materials, and that some of the stone that came as ballast was used for roads. But that's a big one. People don't want to believe that that's not the case, that things were gathered from local materials. Another one I hear is, I'm looking at outbuildings, and they'll say, the slits in that outbuilding were there for shooting at quote unquote Native American raiders. And I have to explain, probably not. These are, for ventilation and keeping out animals from your meat house, which is usually what kind of building it is. I also hear that my house was used as a Civil War hospital. And we know that there were dedicated, hospitals in larger towns, and most sites of engagements had a dedicated hospital, either in a house or in a field. And if a wounded soldier came to a house and was tended to, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a hospital. There are diaries and letters, and I encourage people to research this so that you could have, proof and hearsay, proof other than hearsay for this claim, and I'm listing these because these are important for National Register listing. So I think that those are the main myths that I come across, along with the ones that Jessica and Lena have talked about. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Karice, are you ready to do some Q&A?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I had myself muted. Yes, it's time for the Q&A session. We have a few questions. I just want to let everyone know that even if we don't get to you today, that we will follow up by mail. So the first question that we received is from Lauren Murphy. And she wants to know, does Preservation Virginia and the Department of Historic Resources think that we should amend our collective viewpoints as preservationists about green technologies like solar panels in historic districts and buildings? Right now, most guidance from the Park Service on down suggests that we should put it where you can't see it. But is that sustainable going forward?
Jessica, is that one that you would like to answer?
Yes, I had started talking and I realized I was still muted. So I definitely think as time moves on, things are always in flux. So I think there's different ways that we can talk about this, whether we're talking about tax credits specifically, or whether we're talking about kind of just historic districts. And so kind of making sure that whatever we as a field decide to do, that it is kind of targeted to specific neighborhoods and areas, so that whatever we're doing, we're not turning our local communities into solar fields where might not be you don't want a reflection bouncing into your window, when you're trying to watch TV, you don't want the solar panel to laser into your house. So it's worth always having these conversations. Right now we do worry about the character of a historic building when we're dealing with specifically, again, tax credits, to make sure that whatever new work is being done isn't kind of overwhelming the historic building. So unfortunately, with solar panels, depending on where those are placed, those can have a pretty outsized impact on the appearance of a building. So that's just kind of my rambling on how kind of we're looking at solar panels. It's a complex issue, and I don't think there's any kind of way we can have a universal decision. It kind of has to be place by place, location by location, and kind of figuring out how best we can meet everybody's needs, but also, not kind of have those unintended results.
Okay, the next question is preservation more expensive than a new construction?
So that's one of I'll also take this, and Maral, and feel free to weigh in. So it depends on how you're looking at things. And so, a piece, the specific materials required for preservation might be more costly than a comparable modern feature. So we can look at windows. Let's say restoring a historic wood window versus replacing it with a modern vinyl window. So your first cost for the historic window, rehabilitating that might cost more than that single vinyl window replacement. However, if you look at the longevity and how you're able to use that window over, a decade, 2 decades, the costs really even out. We've looked at vinyl windows and kind of their long-term stability, and in order to make up with energy savings or kind of any of those sorts of things, it takes the windows about 20 to 30 years to be able to kind of recoup those costs and kind of make them pay for themselves. However, a lot of modern vinyl windows, they're not able to be repaired. They do have issues with thermal shrinkage, specifically along seams, specifically when we're talking about vinyl windows. So kind of the more cheap examples. And so you're going to have an issue with deterioration and them losing their sealing. And so you're going to kind of lose those benefits, and then they might need to be replaced, as opposed to a historic window where the individual members can be replaced, you can repaint them, you can use storm windows to protect them. So while you're kind of doing an initial investment that might be more, you're getting often a more stable product kind of long term. So yes, but that's kind of why the tax credit program exists, is to kind of help incentivize / help out with some of those cost disparities.
Okay, here's the next question. Would you say that local historic districts or overlay districts have the most protections for historic buildings?
I'll leave that to Lena.
Could you repeat that, Karice? My audio is a little choppy.
Yes. Would you say that local historic districts or overlay districts have the most protection for historic buildings?
I have no idea. It depends on the local government and how they implement their preservation program. Some local governments are more they have been able to keep up with the sort of evolving needs of their communities by updating design review guidelines and providing training for local architectural review board members. And then other local governments struggle with that due to mostly to lack of funding, and especially the smaller local governments and rural areas are especially challenged in that regard. So it depends on where you're living and what level of support in terms of funding and staffing, if you're gonna have a local government that's enthusiastic about historic preservation.
Okay, so the next question is, my 150-year-old home suffered extensive water damage over the years due to prior owners' failure to maintain the structure of our turret. Can we see tax credits for the cost of these repairs? The leak is corrected now.
Yep. Oh, definitely. That's actually very common. Whether the roof failed or just some flashing failed and you never were able to, you didn't notice it until, something really dastardly happened. That's very common, and tax credits do work for any of those sorts of issues. Again, you need to meet that substantial rehabilitation test, that 25% of the assessed value. But depending, that's can be, hopefully met if you have an overall rehabilitation project.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. With the scarcity of good quality wood trees and the advent of new materials, are we looking at changing the material guidelines?
That is a huge question that I can't really answer. I know that we're constantly, by we, I mean the preservation community. So we're talking about the National Park Service and state preservation, state historic preservation offices. It's definitely something that we know can be an issue. We don't necessarily have good answers yet. So not a great answer, but it's something that we're aware of. But as of this point, nothing has changed as far as kind of how we deal with things.
Okay, great. I do have one more question, and we do have time. And so is there anything a homeowner can do if their NRHP house is next to a vacant lot that is rumored to become a small condominium complex?
So that would be working, and Lena might have more to say, that would be working with your local, so if you have a local historic commission or your local government, the state or national register programs don't have any sort of way to I mean, there's no mechanism, or it's not the purpose of those programs. So unfortunately, it really is, work with your local community, your local government, your neighbors, to hopefully, come to some sort of resolution. Lena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just would say that decision to put multiple family housing next to a single dwelling is going to be a decision made by the local planning commission, because the land has to be zoned and permitted for that use. So you do need to work with your local government on that. And I know that up in, I think it's Arlington County, there's currently a lot of discussion happening with regard to changing some of their local zoning practices that specify only single family dwellings in a lot of neighborhoods, because they are hoping to find ways to increase density. And I suspect that pretty much any urban / suburban community that's experiencing rapid growth is going to be going in that direction. So as usual, keeping up with what your local government is doing is always a good idea.
Okay, that's going to wrap up our Q&A session. And any questions that you have that were not answered on the webinar or in the chat will be answered in a follow-up email. So I'm going to kick it on over to Elizabeth to wrap it up.
Thank you so much for handling our Q&A, and thank you to all our panelists for the information that they've conveyed. I know I'm going to go away thinking about this and come up with more myths, so maybe we'll have Dispelling Myths #2 session. And I want to thank you all that have attended for both your attention and your questions. As we've said a couple of times, we will be sending a follow-up email that will contain a link to a recording of this presentation. We'll also be posting those links on Preservation Virginia and DHR's websites. I would encourage you to mark your calendar for May 31st, as Jessica mentioned, where we'll explore historic tax credit program and how it applies to homeowners. And you can check Preservation Virginia's website, where you'll find both our virtual and our in-person programming for this spring for festivals and events. So again, I want to thank all of our participants. It's been a great session, and we look forward to many more. So take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.